So, I'm really pleased to introduce Teddy Prout, who is going to talk to us about the work of Faithless. He's had an interesting career, not ending up, but at the moment with Humanists UK. And I would like you, Teddy, to tell us a little bit about yourself, how you came to be where you are, and so on. Good. Teddy.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. Oh, I'm even moving on. So, first, welcome, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here in the sunshine that is Shropshire. It's wonderful, so much nicer than London, which is where I'm from. And you know, it was a very quick 4 hours that went by to get here. Always wonderful. A little bit about me just before I begin. So let me just talk a little bit about my current role. I'm the Director of Community Services at Humanists UK, which means that I'm responsible for everything that is public facing. I could do an entire talk just on the community services, and obviously that's not why we're here today. But we engage in a lot of activity, like ceremonies, as you've already heard someone talk about, pastoral care, where we provide emotional support, psychological support to people in institutions, places where you can't just get up and go for a walk. So we're talking about hospitals and hospices, we're talking about universities, and we're talking about prisons. We're talking about the armed forces and other areas where it is a very contained and very institutionalised space in which people find themselves. We obviously do a lot of education, so we train a lot of school speakers to go and talk to various children all across the country. Last year, we spoke to somewhere around 22,000 students just about what is humanism, what the humanists believe, in the same way that schools invite vicars and rabbis and imams and other people in to talk about their own worldview. And in terms of a charity, that puts us only below St John's Ambulance in terms of the number of children that we were able to reach. And we can only do that by, of course, having a huge number of school speaker volunteers. And if anybody feels like that's something that you might want to be involved in, I would strongly urge you to go to the website and to look at volunteering to do that. Now, there are various other things that we do that face the community, that provide support for people where they are in the location of wherever they are across the UK. Sections like Defence Humanists, for those that serve, LGBT humanists, young humanist students at university, programmes around dialogue and interfaith and belief groups, and several others. And those are all the things for which I'm responsible. So that is my job. Before working at Humanists UK, I worked as the National Lead for Education and Early Years Royal Mencap Society, the learning disability charity. But my career before moving into charities was as a teacher. I eventually became an assistant head at a big West London academy, working in a Church of England faith school, which for me at that time wasn't a particularly big deal, because at that time I was a Christian. I am now a humanist. I don't have to be a humanist in order to work for Humanists UK. Makes it a little bit easier for my job, but it's not a genuine occupational requirement or anything. When I was in my teens and early 20s, particularly, I was a member of a charismatic evangelical church. I was an evangelical Christian. And various things came quite naturally to me, the whole prayer. You will probably sense a little bit in my style of delivery that I still retain a little of that evangelical manner of talking, so I hope it doesn't put too many people off. That certainly isn't my intention. My subject while I was a teacher was music, and music was probably one of the ways in which I found a kind of very good avenue for expressing sort of beliefs and things, and still is, though sort of beliefs, it must be said. Towards the later part of my 20s, I mellowed a little and was quite Anglican in my approach. There were always two things that I disagreed with the early churches to which I went and worshipped and did things. And those were that women should be treated equally with men, I couldn't see any justification for why women should be subservient. It didn't make sense to me then. I didn't believe that was okay. And the other was that lesbians and gay men should be treated with respect and dignity and afforded equal rights wherever possible. And one of the reasons that I felt that was because when I was 15, back in the dark days of the very early 90s, when things like Section 28 still existed, the prohibition on local authorities talking at all about homosexuality, when it was illegal to serve in the armed forces if you were gay, when the age of consent was not equal, and that civil partnership and equal marriage were but twinkles in the eye of Peter Tatchell, I came out as gay to my charismatic church. And a lot of what happened was, oh, it's fine. We love the sinner. I ended up leading the carol service, the Easter service, weekly services in the chaplaincy department, of which I was a member, and all those sorts of things. And then I hit 35, I think I was, so a few years ago now. And I suddenly realised that I just didn't believe it. I just suddenly, almost overnight, realised I couldn't hold that these things were true. And if I couldn't hold that these things were true, then these things weren't true either, and if those things weren't true, then none of it made sense to me. And in that moment, though, I decided, rather than just saying, well, I'm a Christian but I don't really believe, it felt so fake, so false, so underhand, that I just said, no, I'm an atheist. Then I became a really angry atheist for about 2 years, and this is a very common experience of apostates, particularly apostates who had a very either evangelical or very conservative or very traditional form of upbringing in religion. You go through a phase of, I can't believe whatever it is that you can't believe. I can't believe I was lied to. I can't believe that I ever thought that was true. I can't believe that I was treated so badly. I can't believe all sorts of things. And then I saw a wonderful little talk on YouTube, having watched a lot of Christopher Hitchens and a lot of Richard Dawkins and a lot of the Atheist Experience, which is the Texan show that happens to be very angry and all that kind of stuff. And I saw this lovely little thing that A.C. Grayling and Andrew Copson were in dialogue with two Christians. I can't remember the name of the Christians now. And it was gentle, and it was reasonable, and it was rational, and it was a positive expression of the beliefs that I recognised I had at that moment. And I thought, what is this? And of course it was humanism. And so I went from evangelical Christian to angry atheist to humanist. And I'm very pleased that that's where I am now, ended up. Not least because humanism is the expression of the beliefs that I hold. Now, I know there have been a few jokes in there, and I'm afraid to say that the rest of my talk does not quite have as many laughs, because I'm going to talk to you now about the journey that apostates go through. What some of the consequences of leaving one's religion are for people who do so in the UK right now. So I'm not talking about in Saudi Arabia or Bangladesh, where we know what happens if you leave your religion. It's a capital crime to be an apostate in those countries. You will be executed. I'm talking about in the UK, and I'm talking about the 21st century. Okay. So, before I do, just perhaps a quick show of hands. How many people have heard of apostasy? Heard of apostate? Most, almost all. Excellent. How many people, if I were to say, can you give me a definition of apostate, would be comfortable doing so? Okay, good. Okay. I would like to start by saying that nothing I say here, even if it may come across as so, is to denigrate anybody with a religion at all. I'm not interested in doing that. Humanists UK and our programme Faithless is not there to proselytise. We are not there to change people's minds or encourage them away from religion and into humanism. That is not our purpose. Rather, the programme works with people who have already made that decision and are finding it very difficult to do so. At most humanist groups at which I talk, there are a handful at least of religious people, and I wouldn't want to feel that those people felt in any way as though I was having a go at them or I was ridiculing their religion or anything along those lines. I am not doing so. And so if anyone here is religious and they say anything that you feel is problematic, please talk to me afterwards, but take an apology in advance if I put something badly. It isn't meant that way. So why is this work needed? Why do we need to help apostates? Well, a couple of quick case studies of what's going on at the moment that makes that the case. A university student approached us a couple of years ago now and said that he was an ex-Muslim. And he had come to us because when he went to the university pastoral support team for some help, because he felt under a lot of pressure from people who were his peers and very open about their slightly more traditionalist form of Islam, they referred him to a Muslim support group. They literally did not know what else to do. There's a phone-in line counselling service that somebody called and said, I need to leave, I'm a Muslim, I need to leave my religion, I don't believe in this, and the person referred them to their local mosque. There is, and I won't name which one, but there is a very famous phone-in service who, when the child called in to say, I'm going to leave my religion and this is very, very difficult for me, who in this case was an ex-Jehovah Witness. The reply was, fake it till you make it. How can I reconnect you with your faith? How can I get you back into the church? What can I do to support you to go the other way than the direction you have been talking to me about? We have now spoken to them and they have changed their policy on that, very pleased to say. And of course, this is nothing in comparison to the countless stories that we hear on a weekly basis of people who were shut in their rooms and not allowed out, who were beaten and abused by their friends and family for saying that they no longer believed in God. From the stories of an organisation with whom we do an awful lot of work called Karma Nirvana. It's a very good organisation. They work with honour-based abuse and honour-based violence, where they work with, in addition to working with people who are survivors of those, they work with the offenders and perpetrators in prisons, who then say that they have done nothing wrong because they were defending the honour of their family or of their religion. And in some cases, those crimes for which they've been put in prison isn't just abuse, they go all the way up to honour-based killings. People are being murdered for the crime of apostasy. So, what is apostasy? Just before I do, there is one thing that we do want to try and tackle, which is this idea of losing one's faith, and the idea that that is somehow a negative thing to lose one's faith. Almost universally in the media, and certainly in sort of the American influenced media that exists here, the idea of losing your faith is a desperate weakness in somebody, and we want to try and ensure that losing one's faith is, well, A, not a term that is used, it is changing one's belief, but also that it isn't necessarily a bad thing. So, what is apostasy? Well, you can read, I shall leave you to do so. The word itself, I'm going to mispronounce this because I'm not a classicist, but the word itself comes from the Greek root Apostasy, something very similar to that at any rate, which literally means to revolt. So there is a sense that you are going against the grain in terms of the origins of the word. But there are a couple of things within here that I think is particularly interesting. In addition to leaving one's religion, either to go to atheism and humanism, or to go to a different religion, which is still apostasy. The other big part of the word is how much it's used as an insult. So it isn't just that you are an apostate. It is that the mere suggestion that you are an apostate is seen as something that is bad. And most of the things that I will be talking about have a very close analogy to being gay. We talk of apostates coming out. The term gay is one of the biggest insults on playgrounds in the UK at the moment. Huge problems in schools of this word being bandied around. And it doesn't mean that the child is gay, it means that the child is perceived as gay, and that is still bad. And the same with apostate and the various, murtad, kafir approach to it as well. It isn't that they are necessarily, it's the perception that they might be that creates the problem. And what do we know? Well, the answer here, I'm afraid, is actually very little. We work with a lot of people across all parts of the country, but the amount of research that has been done on this is incredibly small. So we have a lot of case studies of people who have left and what they've gone through. We have a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence of things that have happened to people, but what we don't have are the large-scale quantitative studies that are able to track mental health in apostates, employment prospects in apostates, and those sorts of things. We would dearly love to do so, but it is extremely difficult to get anyone interested in doing that research in the first place, and it is quite expensive. But there are a few things that are worth mentioning. 200,000 ex-Muslims in the UK. To put that into context, there are 2.7 million Muslims in the UK at the moment. So there's a very significant number of those Muslims are ex-Muslims. And of course, people who might identify as being ex-Muslim but wouldn't ever tick in the census box that they were Muslim. So there are all of those things. Little interesting thing in how did Faithless start? Well, it started about 3 years ago by two ex-Muslims, Imtiaz and Aliyah Saleem, who had been very active in the ex-Muslim community for a few years. They both had extremely difficult personal experiences, which I won't share with you, but they were very extreme. And having met apostates from other religious groups, so they were part of the ex-Muslim movement, but they'd met a lot of apostates from other religious groups, particularly ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and ex-ultra-Orthodox Jews. And what they realised was the experiences that people were talking about were the same. The emotional states that people went through and some of the consequences of coming out to their family were the same, irrespective of the religion from which they had come. And they realised that what they needed to do was to create a safe and supportive environment for people who were on the apostate journey, irrespective of where they had come from. Either at the beginning of that journey, who were just sort of having questions and starting to kind of unpick what they believed, or people who were ex-believers, but not public, and still needed for reasons of personal safety, often to stay within the religious group, but needed an outlet in order to explain the beliefs that they had. And of course, people who had left were public, but still needed support for a variety of reasons. And many of the apostates who find Faithless had told us that they thought they were the only person going through it. They thought they were entirely unique, and that everybody else that they saw around them were either religious or not religious, and that was it. This very sort of black and white idea of what it means to have belief. It is something that we've also found replicated in a lot of statutory organisations. Social services, police, and various other people will regard people and say, well, what's your religion? And for some people, that isn't a very easy answer to give, because I don't know. I'm on a journey. I don't know where that's going to end up. And 2 years ago, when they recognised that there was a limit to the amount that they could do just between the two of them and a website, they approached Humanists UK and said, look, we've got this idea, we've got this concept, we've got these things happening, it needs to be so much bigger than we can do. Do you want to take it and run with it as a programme? And of course we said yes, immediately seeing the huge benefit that this could be for the thousands of people who come out as apostates every year. And so we did. So what are the negative effects that people experience when they leave religion? Well, broadly speaking, it is divided up into three. Internal conflicts, external conflicts, and then the real or perceived experience that they have. So, in terms of internally, people who leave their religion will go through some, most, or all of those states. Anxiety and depression is extremely common in the apostate community. Instances of self-harm, several times higher than the general population. Attempted suicide, significantly higher than the general population. The idea of isolation and loneliness, I will explain in a moment why that is particularly true of some groups. And the living a double life is, of course, self-evident when you can't tell your parents and your immediate family, and yet you will go off on a Friday night and be around your friends who are all also either non-religious or ex-Muslims or ex-Jehovah's Witnesses or whatever it may be. Interestingly, the second to last one is one that is extremely common, and it was one that I felt very keenly. This idea of guilt and shame. I didn't pray hard enough, I didn't try hard enough, I've somehow lost my way, and if only I could find my way back, everything would be okay. And one of the things that isn't mentioned in there, because I think it's probably not unique to Christianity, but it is certainly something that is not commonly shared. Most evangelical Christians will regard Jesus as their personal friend. It is not a God that is remote to whom you pray in the sort of vague hope that something might happen. It is someone who is a part of your life and who walks beside you. So when you realise that you no longer believe that that person is real, now I doubt very many of you could put yourselves back in the place you were when you were 4 or 5 and had an imaginary friend and suddenly realised that imaginary friend was imaginary and got very upset about it. But that is the sort of thing that we're talking about. Whether Jesus is real or not real, and I now don't believe that he is, doesn't matter. Because the thing that makes the difference is, to my perception, I have lost my best friend. And that is, particularly for Christians, that is a very real thing that they experience internally. So what about externally? Well, Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientologists, and several others, if you declare yourself to no longer believe, will literally shun you from the community. You'll be thrown out of home, you will be not allowed to engage in contact with your friends or your family, and they will act thereafter as though you have died. And it happens without fail in those communities. It happens a lot in Jewish communities, it happens a lot in Muslim communities, and it happens a lot in the more sort of evangelical Pentecostal style of Christianity. But there are some for whom it is universal. A lot of people, a lot of family members will be instantly distrustful of someone who says they don't believe in God. And this is true pretty much across the board. And that is due to, it may be the first person that they actually know who has said, I don't believe in God. Or I don't believe in whatever the religious tenets are. And in a lot of communities in the UK, it is just unheard of. There is an organisation in London called London Black Atheists. And they have called themselves that, and they exist as a group because within the black community, in particularly West and South West London, the idea of being an atheist is simply alien. It is like saying you have three heads. They just do not understand what you are talking about. And so there is a sense of a need for a community within that group, because it is so alien a concept to the community in which they have been raised. And then, of course, there's all the prejudice stuff that come along with it. You know, we're all immoral. I don't know about you, but nihilistic. No, I don't go with that one, I have to say. I'm not a big fan of nihilism. Hedonistic. Well, I have a few vices. I'm not particularly proud of them, but they're a part of me. And then, if we had time, I would go through all of the quotes that I have from religious figures about what it means to be an apostate and what they think of apostasy. And it is pages and pages and pages and pages of it is evil, it is immoral, they should be stoned, it should be against the law. And then I have a collection of statements in support of people being able to leave their religion. And it's about a half page. Rabbi Jonathan Romain, top bloke, absolutely sound. I see no reason why religion should be compulsory. If someone is Jewish and says they don't believe, that's fine by him. Dilwar Hussain, leader of the New Horizons group, which is a very progressive Muslim organisation. I see no good reason for keeping people in a religion in which they no longer believe. Top bloke, absolutely amazing. There are a few others, nowhere near the same number as people who say that, well, whatever it is they say, and I don't need to elaborate on that. These sorts of things are particularly interesting, of course, because they are very clearly against the law, and yet for years the police have decided not to take action. These, particularly, are more likely to happen to children. I have witnessed exorcisms. They are quite brutal. They often involve being hit by things. They certainly involve a lot of screaming and shouting. They are very, very unpleasant. Beating it out of you is something that comes to us as a case study at least once a month. It is just awful. And then the sort of, well, what are the consequences then? And the biggest one of this is that you simply lose access to any form of support that you may have had. If your friends and family say, off you go, we don't want to see you anymore, to whom do you turn in a crisis? I mean, one assumes that if you have been brought up in an environment that is that controlling to begin with, you probably don't have friends outside of that community based around religion. So who do you go to? If you are an ex-Haredi Jew, it is unlikely, whilst you were at school, and they all attend religious Jewish schools, it is unlikely you will have learned English. So how do you access social services? If you have no concept of the language that you would need to use, the words that you would need to use to be able to access those things. And huge numbers of the community are deeply distrustful of the police. So you find yourself homeless, the first port of call that most of us, I suspect, would probably go to would be the police in such a situation to say, what do I do? And they won't go anywhere near the police. I think I've already talked about most of these things. As I said, I'm not very used to talking to slides, so I think I've covered them. I hope so anyway. Now, the last thing that I want to say, of course, is that some of these things, either external or internal conflicts that arise, may only be perceived, they may not be real. So it may be that someone is afraid of physical harm that they think is coming, but it never does. What I say in response to that is it almost doesn't matter the perception for the person is the reality. It is not the fact that my father is beating me. My father didn't beat me. It's the fact that I think he might that is going to create that sense of tension and anxiety and things within. So, what do these things all lead to? I've sort of alluded to most of them already. Unable to adapt to life outside, self-harm, homelessness, poverty as well. If you're from a very close-knit community that supports each other financially, and suddenly you're thrown out of that, often with an education that perhaps isn't as good as it might have been if you were in a secular education, you're not particularly employable. And if you're not particularly employable, your chances of escaping poverty that you have suddenly been thrust into are dramatically reduced. And then, of course, loss of life at the bottom being somewhat self-evident. And on this point, before I kind of move on, I think I'd like to just take a moment to talk a little bit about the journey that apostates go on in order to make a bit of sense of why all of these things happen. So the first one is, of course, the apostate belong. So before you're an apostate, you are a member of that religious community. You have a sense of identity and a sense of community and a sense of belong. Then you have self-doubts. And that's where you start to question, well, do I believe this? Do I believe that? What does that mean? What does that mean? And so on. Then comes the anxiety. And those three stages are universal. I haven't spoken to an apostate who said that they didn't go through those three. With that anxiety then comes various branches. So we are aware of some people who have gone through that anxiety and decided, either because of peer pressure or because of familial relations or because of other external factors, that the best way for them to cope with that is to hunker down and go hardcore. Interestingly, this happens quite frequently in prisons. And we are trying to persuade HMPPS, which used to be the National Offender Management System, that this is a very likely cause for radicalisation in prisons. And at the moment, it's one that is completely ignored. So after that anxiety comes isolation. That sense of, I'm unique, I'm the only one. Nobody else feels like, why don't I get this? Everybody else is praying and it makes sense to everybody else. Why doesn't it make sense to me? I'm completely alone. And then, hopefully, they start to discover their new identity. They start to get a sense of there being an alternative that makes sense, that is coherent, that is acceptable. Not just tolerated, but is acceptable, especially in the UK. And then they confirm that new identity, and then they find themselves belonging to a new community. All of you lovely people here. One hopes. So, it is the last three of those stages of the apostate's journey that Faith to Faithless most concerns itself with in terms of casework. So we talk to people who have gone through the anxiety or experiencing the anxiety and the isolation and are on their way to finding their new identity, and that's the point at which we find we can have most impact and most use. So, what do we do? Well, those things is all we do. We raise the awareness of experiences that apostates have and the challenges they face, largely by doing a lot of media. So there are a lot of campaigns that we run, a lot of promotional events, a lot of networking. We run panel discussions, lectures and talks about what it is that apostates face and what it is that they do. And we try and do so wherever possible by using people who are apostates themselves. So if an academic is going to talk about some sociological impact or psychological impact on an apostate, we will make sure that there is an apostate there who can talk about their own experiences as well. We're big believers in experts by experience, which I believe is the NHS term for it. And we want to work within humanist communities to raise the awareness of this as an issue. There are very few humanists who are going to look at that and say, oh, just get over it, pull yourself up. There are very few, but there are an awful lot of people who just don't think it is as serious as it is. An awful lot of people who were very liberal Church of England members who think leaving the religion is just a case of saying, actually, I won't go to church on Sunday, it'll be fine. And of course, for a lot of people, that just isn't the case. We are conducting a lot of research, and we are working very hard to try and write the first ever State of Apostasy of the UK report, which will highlight what life is like, some of the statistics that we can find on it, what some of the key issues are for them personally, but also societally, so what are the institutional barriers to support being able to be given to apostates, and all those sorts of things. And this, we hope, will be of huge help in our political campaigning work, in order to ensure that councils and institutions and statutory bodies and so on have the correct policies in place in order to be able to support apostates that arrive in their services. We provide a very welcoming and supportive community. We run social events throughout the year for apostates, lots of befriending meetups, lots of kind of events out to places. We try and avoid, wherever possible, having too many of them in places like pubs, because even if you were, for sake of argument, an ex-Jehovah's Witness who wouldn't have drunk whilst in the community, there's an awful lot of why I won't drink that carries through into your apostate life. An awful lot of ex-Muslims and ex-Jews don't eat pork. No, they openly say there's no reason why I shouldn't, I choose not to. And so we tend not to have them in pubs. What we do try and do is make sure that they're somewhere very public. So we've had one very recently, for example, in the cafe of the British Museum, because if you are chatting, as we do, and one of their friends comes in and they're not out, then all they're doing is having a coffee in the British Museum and they can walk away. We try and make all of the events as safe as possible, being ever mindful that for some people, even having coffee may be putting them in danger. And of course we signpost apostates that get in touch with us to our resources, which are online, to our guide, and to organisations that can support them in the immediacy of their crisis, whatever it may be. So be it homelessness charities, be it social services, be it whatever it may be. We're developing an ever greater library of resources, if for no other reason than when we started, we were thinking that we were going to create 7 guides for the 7 main religions from whom apostates came. And then we would get a case study in of somebody who came from a religion that we hadn't thought would be a problem. And so we thought, right, well, we'd better write a guide for that one as well. And then another one came in. We're now up to 30. We haven't written them all yet, because it's quite tricky to write these guides. But it gives you some sense, at least, of the scale that we're talking about. And I have no doubt that number will grow ever more as we find more and more, particularly cults, of which we just simply are not aware as they come out to us. And this is the, we do lots of developing relationships with stakeholders. That goes without saying, I think. The one above it is the one I'm particularly interested in and particularly proud of, not least because I wrote it. We provide training for organisations who are likely to be the first line of contact with apostates. So those people that I was just talking about, police forces, social services, counselling services, those sorts of things, in order to get them, first, to understand what it is that apostates go through. Second, what are the safeguarding issues that might arise as a result of them being an apostate? To give them tools and ways of understanding how to have conversations about what, for a lot of people, is a topic that they would never enter. You know, never talk about religion and politics. Doubly so in the case of most service providers. But if the reason the person is there is because they want to talk about the religion from which they are leaving, they've got to have a space to be able to do so. And a lot of social services people, a lot of police officers are just very unconfident to have those conversations. And then, of course, the last one is to work with them in sort of workshops that then follow from that about, well, what does your policy say about this? What does your policy say about that? Do you feel that that is adequate given what we've just been talking about? How can we help you change it? How can we make sure that the work we do doesn't just impact and influence you, but the next generation of people who are going to work in your organisation and the next generation of apostates who are going to arrive on your door saying, help me, and how are you going to do that? We've already got them being delivered to the London Metropolitan Police Force, to Childline, to Adult Social Services in London, but we need it to be across the UK. We're not a London-centric organisation. We're not interested in only doing things in London. It's useful that some of the major organisations, major national organisations are in London, but we want to go everywhere. So we've made it free for statutory organisations for the first year. Anyone that wants it, any size, free of charge, you can have people coming along and going through these things and providing you with tools to make sure that your policies are fit for purpose. I think that was what I was talking about. Good. Yes. I hope I have not overstayed my welcome, but a few what can you do? I hope. Being there, I think, is the most critical thing. Being part of a humanist community and part of a humanist group, you are bound at some point to have someone come in, and when you talk to them, they say, well, actually, I haven't told any of my family, but I'm Sikh, and my dad would beat me up if he knew that I was here. Being there, listening to them, not judging them, just being there for them. I can't imagine that any humanist would do so, but not ridiculing their religion, not ridiculing the beliefs that for some of them they may still hold some of the beliefs. Some of them, they've just kind of said, well, that this bit doesn't make sense to me, so I want to find out more. I want to find other worldviews that might better fit my own. And of course, keeping things to yourself. If they tell you something that's very personal, they may not be ready to go public. And signpost them to us. Get them onto the website and tell them about us and tell them that they're not alone. That there are lots and lots of people in the UK who know exactly what they're going through, because that's what we're here for. Tell other people, for sure, tell other people. Tell the police force, tell social services, tell organisations that you know and are familiar with. If you think that they're likely to come into contact with apostates and probably don't have a policy or a process to be able to deal with having those conversations, say, hey, do you know that this organisation exists and is prepared to give you training for free? Teachers. If you know a local school that has perhaps a slightly higher than average number of people from a particular religious group where you think, I'll bet some of them are not still religious. We run an RE conference for RE teachers. And last year, I spoke about this to about 100 RE teachers from various places across England. And almost universally they said, A, I didn't even know this was a thing and I teach RE. B, this sounds like a massive safeguarding issue and it doesn't appear anywhere in our safeguarding policy. Schools and teachers may be a very good way to ensure that at the very least the safeguarding of children can happen. And then, well, what else can you do? Two last things. I'll do the corporate one first. We are a charity. Faithless is a programme of Humanists UK. Humanists UK is the national charity that defends the rights of the non-religious, challenges the privileges that the religious people in this country are afforded, and challenge discrimination against religious people on grounds of secularism. We want a secular state. We don't want to tell people that they can't be religious. They have every right to be religious. We want to challenge privilege and discrimination equally. But we are a charity. And so if anybody feels that this is the sort of work that should be supported, putting on free training courses, well, it's free for them. It's not free for us. And so any support that you wanted to give, either in terms of time, expertise, money, of course would be very gratefully received. And I know that most of you are members of Humanists UK, but of course becoming a member of Humanists UK is one of the best ways of standing up in support of things like this. And then I'm going to end, I think, with my last one. And my last one is a bit of a personal thing. It's a conversation that I've been having with a number of people over quite some time now, which is, what do you call yourself? Now, we are a collection of humanists, probably, and I don't know what the collective noun for humanists is. My own personal thought is an argument with free thinkers and skeptics and brights, atheists and agnostics and whatever else you want to describe yourself. And my plea is this: in public, call yourself a humanist. In private and amongst people you know, call yourself whatever you want. But in public, call yourself a humanist. Because calling yourself a humanist puts you in a community of people who have a coherent worldview, who stand up for positive ideals of secularism, of equality, of equal rights, of morality and ethics, of living well and happy. And that is something that a significant number of people in the UK right now cannot do. Whilst it's fine to have role models like some of our wonderful patrons, like Stephen Fry, Sandy Toxford, Adam Rutherford, Jim Alpalidi, and say, I am a humanist. They're very distant. They're very on a pedestal. Meeting ordinary people who are willing to stand up and say, I'm a humanist, will mean an awful lot to the next generation of apostates who right now feel that that is not a label that they could use for themselves, because to do so risks untold, unknowing harm to themselves. So my last final plea is, no matter what else you do, call yourself a humanist, because actually it's a pretty fine thing to do. Thank you very much.